I'm Peter Kohalmi. I came from Hungary, from Budapest and from Szeged, and I'm very glad to be here. In the last couple of years, I've been researching the oeuvre of Miklós Erdély, and I've just finished his first monograph, so I'm going to talk about him. Sorry for my English, I only try to read my text. Miklós Erdély was born in 1928 and died in 1986. The larger is the distance between us and the closing of his oeuvre, the clearer we see that he was the most prominent artist of Hungarian neo-avant-garde. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about three artworks from him: the film titled Version, the installation God, God, and the time travel photomontage series. But before doing this, I would like to shortly introduce the context of his works. There are two different approaches to Eastern Central European neo-avant-garde in the 1960s and 70s. To put it simply, until recently, the dominant approach to Hungarian neo-avant-garde was to compare it to Western tendencies. Western avant-garde conceptual and formal schemes were detected in Eastern European art, in this way justifying that the countries of the Eastern Bloc also gave rise to tendencies similar to Western artistic trends. Of course, this is a self-justificatory interpretation which hides important contextual factors. During the last couple of years, a new kind of demand appeared: to interpret the arts of the 1960s and the 1970s its own context. Within this broader framework, Miklós Erdély's work can be seen as an example for the fact that the artistic representation of the Holocaust differs along the borders of the different nation-states. Although the Holocaust is the common tragedy of the humankind, the ways of remembering or teaching the Holocaust has taken highly different forms in Hungary, in the United States, in Germany, or in the Netherlands. While Ernst van Alpen writes in his book, Caught by History, that he became supersaturated by the Holocaust during his school years in Holland, and he could return to this topic only with the help of arts, in Hungary, the situation has been the absolute opposite. In the past couple of years, it is not the supersaturation of education that should be solved. Instead, the country needs to wake up from a collective amnesia. While international research on the relationship between the arts and memory has been focused on the question whether how can a new generation remember those events that they never experienced, in Hungary, the question is whether how do people remember events that they never experienced and which events were concealed from them. How has this situation become possible? As a matter of fact, Jews of the Hungarian countryside were deported under German command, but with the active participation of Hungarian authorities in 1944. By this time, the majority of adult Jewish men were on forced labor service, as was my own grandfather. Most of these men did not die in the war, but were killed by Hungarian soldiers. Jews from Budapest were confined to a ghetto, and in 1994, a series of mass murders were committed against them. Still, in the aftermath of 1945, public talk about the Holocaust was not started in Hungary. Years of denial, silence, and forgetting were to come. The artistic projection of this is twofold. From the 1950s to the 70s, there were two kinds of artworks in connection with the Holocaust: commissioned works and the individual pieces. Commissioned works were serving the official politics of memory. At the center of this self-legitimating narrative were not the victims, but the anti-fascist fight with its communist heroes. An example for this is the work of Miklós Erdély from 1962. Its title is Memorial Sculpture. The main value of the work, according to the jury of the sculpture application, was that it highlights the battle against fascism. And indeed, the figures standing with their backs to each other do not remind us of the prisoners of concentration camps. They rather look like workers at a demonstration. As opposed to this, individual works concentrated on the victims, remembering, and responsibility, but this manifold artistic reflection was recognized only by few people. Artists such Miklós Erdély and the whole Hungarian neo-avant-garde in general belonged to the prohibited or tolerated categories, so their works could have been exhibited only in less frequented places and only for a few days. The first exhibition of this kind generating wider discussion was organized on the 60th Holocaust Remembrance Day in 2004 under the title The Hidden Holocaust. Although my presentation is not concerned with our present times, but I still would like to mention one thing. It's really painful that right after 1989, anti-Semitic voices could appear in Hungarian political life under the umbrella of the freedom of speech. It is also painful that in 2014, the Orban government erected the memorial to the victims of the German occupation. Beyond belonging to the category of aesthetic kitsch or aesthetic trash, it is a rude example for historical forgery. Victims are silenced once again, similarly to the narrative of the Communist Party state. What appears instead is the eagle, the symbol of Germany, occupying Hungary, and Gabriel Archangel as the figure of the innocent Hungary. Fortunately, the context has somewhat changed. Finally, the Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, did not unveil the memorial, and the civil society organizations were demonstrating around the sculpture for more than a year, forming a living memorial there. But most probably, the 60 years long silence and the new memory politics built on denial have all contributed to the possibility of spreading anti-Semitic posters all over the country, figuring either the dehumanized other with a different religion and darker skin color, or George Soros as the leader of the invisible background power, according to the Hungarian government's narrative. In Freud's words, something is shifting from heimlich to unheimlich here. The most horrible past is paying a ghostly return in Hungary. But let's return to the actual topic of my presentation, Miklós Erdély. In Hungary, the first impulses of conceptual art started to gain strength in the second half of the 1960s, and by the 1970s, it became the most decisive trend of the avant-garde movement. These years intersect with the appearance of Miklós Erdély on the artistic stage. Soon his presence became impossible to evade due to his artifacts, his vibrant, authentic, and extraordinary perspective, and his marked habitus. Bit by bit, he became the most significant master of the era, the central figure for younger generations, the free artist of the avant-garde movement, a movement in a constant search for new directions. He detached himself from the narrow understandings of conceptual art already by the mid-1970s, but the dense conceptual motivation and the interdisciplinary attitude remained inherent to his works till the end. The oeuvre's significant source is Erdély's personal experience. He was an Israelite whose family suffered terrible losses. Erdély himself was on forced labor service, and of his 4 siblings, only one managed to return home from the torments of concentration camps. He has several works that are concerned with the question of anti-Semitism and the trauma of Shoah. Poems, collages, installations using mezzo, bitumen, and melted lead. Because my time is limited here, I'm going to talk about 3 artworks only. The film, titled Version, was completed in 1979. The Holocaust does not appear in it directly. It is represented by an earlier motif of history. This was the only way for Erdély to find a legitimate way to talk about the experience of the Holocaust. The film was banned nonetheless. The first screening was allowed only after Erdély's death, after 1990. The version is the adaptation of a markedly Hungarian context, the blood libel case of Tiszaeszlár, Hungary, at the end of the 18th century. This was the last blood libel case in Europe in which 15 Jewish men were accused with the ritual murder of a Christian girl, Eszter Solymosi. The investigation was led by an anti-Semite judge who managed to make the young boy, Moritz Schraff, to testify against his own father. The film is not only the adaptation of the blood libel case, it also gives a representation of the process of anti-Semitism's growth and expansion. A considerable part of the film is dedicated to the boy's rehearsal for his false testimony at the show trial. It shows the process through which a lie becomes reality due to being repeated long enough. The process during which the repetition of lies infiltrates Moritz Schraff's imagination. The process through which such lies become alive through filmic images. The audience is trapped in this process. No matter how hard we try to reconstruct the narrative, we are able to separate the different versions of the truth only momentarily. Even though we are aware that the testimony is a lie, watching the police officer hammering the words in the boy feels like it is also happening to us. By the time the boy is broken, we also know the charges word for word. At the same time, we also see the images of violence from the boy's viewpoint, as if the murder had happened in reality. In this way, reality becomes not only visible, but also directly experienceable in the film. It confronts us not with facts, but with different versions of the truth replacing facts, the mechanism by which suspicion permeates our inner selves, the shame of anti-Semitism's materialization in front of our eyes. And finally, it confronts us with the viewer's subjection to easy manipulation. In her book, The Threshold of the Visible Man, Kaja Silverman borrows the term heteropathic memory from Max Scheler, which is connected to the introduction of not me into my memory preserve. Ernst van Alpen, in his writing Playing the Holocaust, goes back to Silverman's thoughts and writes about toy art, which is also built on heteropathic identification. Nevertheless, what van Alpen highlights is that in the process of identification, one risks becoming similar to the other. And in the case of Holocaust, the other is the morally other, which is not a distant, unthinkable evil power. The self, even if momentarily, but is able to identify with the perpetrator. The summary of his article could have been written about the version itself. Exclusive identification with the victims, although useful to realize how horrible the Holocaust was, is also a way of reassuring visitors about a fundamental innocence. To put the case strongly, this reassurance is unhelpful in achieving the ultimate goal of Holocaust education, to prevent history from repeating itself. Victimhood cannot control the future. In contrast, temporary identification with the perpetrators contributes to an awareness of the ease with which one slides into a measure of complicity. A similar principle is at work in Erdély's work from 1974. Here again, he does not reflect on the Holocaust simply or directly. It is a sharp critique towards his contemporary society's relation to the Holocaust. Miklós Erdély was waiting for a long time for his brothers to return, but instead of them, he received a letter in 1973 that informed him about the reparations he was offered for his brothers killed in the war, which was precisely 8,125 Hungarian forints. In 1974, he sent the money along with 2 shot glasses to a Hungarian sculpture biennial. He asked the organizers to buy a bottle of kosher peach palinka, kosher Hungarian fruit brandy with the money and exhibited together with the bills, the shot glasses, and the official statement of the reparations, and also to offer the brandy to the visitors so that they can raise their glasses to the dead, or to have a drink to silence their conscience, we could add. The title of the installation was God, God. God, God, a formula used at clinking of glasses in Hungarian. God, God is not a memorial, and the touching of glasses is not a way to remembering those who died in the Shoah. The plan of the installation confronts us with collective denial and the grotesque effort of the reparations. The play, the sour wordplay, God, God, hardly and mercilessly grips life. We have to decide whether we drink or not. And of course, those who take the drink with no reflection become complicit. Just as those who do not allow the artwork to be exhibited, they also become complicit. God forces us to respond, and it was not left unanswered at its first exhibition either. The plan was refused first by the organizers of the Hungarian Biennale, then by the Folkwang Museum in Essen, Germany. It was exhibited for the first time in 1991. I quote Erdély. Those who refuse to drink must find loathsome the procedure or is being exhibited. They do not let their indignation be silenced by a small glass of brandy. I wonder whether how much would it take for them not to be angry? How much hectoliter brandy would they accept as an atonement? The money must be taken, it must be used for the demonstration against the procedure. And by this, the giver and the taker will be warned that the unatonable must be left in its own absolute. The version and the God are both powerful artworks, as they provocatively transfer idiopathic identification with the victims to the field of heteropathic identification with the perpetrator. This paradigm shift happened only later, in the second and third generation of artists. So with a modernist look, we could say that Erdély foreshadowed new aspects of the Holocaust representation. But it's more proper to call his perspective a hybrid, because Erdély, transgressing the silence that surrounded the Holocaust in Hungary, provocatively demonstrated the grotesque nature of the system, while he stood beside the untouchable and unrepresentable nature of the Holocaust.
You have 2 more minutes.
Okay. The final work I would like to mention is the time travel. It was at the beginning of the 1970s that Erdély started to think about the relationship between the original and copy, sameness and difference, periodicity and continuity, and he wrote his thesis on the theory of repetition and studies in theory of identification. This line of thought was expanded until the end of his career, widened with the question of remembrance that became more important for Erdély, appearing in his text and various artistic media. Erdély created the time travel photomontage series at the end of the 1970s. It consists of 5 photos of himself and his family, among them his relatives who lost their lives during the Shoah, and he copied into these old photo images of himself made for this very purpose. The central image of the time travel series is the one on which Erdély whispers into the ears of his younger self. At this point, I would like to quote a couple of lines from one of Erdély's writings, in which remembrance is posited as the basis of identity. The title of this text, Time Möbius. Only that which turns back and impacts itself as a cause is capable of molding itself. That which impacts itself as a cause is already in the form in which it would like to mold itself. If you live in the awareness that in each moment you have, you can reconvert, you are enclosed within your own redemption. Man is therefore subjugated to the one who knows him, her best, him, herself. I hope that these three pieces of art I have managed to give you a glimpse on Erdély's oeuvre. Of course, there are a lot of his works that should be mentioned in connection with the Holocaust, but it would be also interesting to pay attention to the relationship between the Holocaust and the different generations of the Erdély family. The grandson of Miklós Erdély, Miklós Erdély, was the director of photography of the Oscar-winner film Son of Saul. So, thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
And excuse me, but my English is a bit clumsy, so I would like to postpone any conversations until the coffee break. So thank you and excuse me.
Thanks.